Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to tonight's stream. Sorry, I'm running a couple of minutes late here, but we're gonna get started in just a second. So, if you guys are in the chat, be sure to make sure that you're logging in so you can ask me questions as we go. We're gonna be building an entire beginner scene in Blender tonight from the ground up. So, if you missed last night, don't worry about it. You can go back and watch. All of my streams are uploaded and saved to my YouTube channel. And so lots of streams. This is actually stream number 17. So there's already a lot of content there if you want to go back and watch it. And I will be watching for comments and, of course, live questions tonight. So thank you for joining me. One thing as we get into this is my voice is kind of a little scratchy tonight. So I apologize if I have to take a minute and take a drink or something like that. But excited to be here, excited to help you guys get started with Blender if you're watching this. So let's jump into it. All right, let me get my screen up over here. Okay. So last night we talked a lot about how to get in here and create objects, things like this, and then how to edit objects using our tools over here, difference between object mode, edit mode, all that sort of stuff. I'm going to go a little quicker tonight because we are trying to get an entire scene done so that we can start animating tomorrow night. So let's kind of jump into this and rebuild what we did yesterday. So let's start with a plane. I'm just going to go to create over here and select plane. If you want to scale this up, you can, of course, use the global manipulation widget down here, or the keyboard shortcuts for these are G for move. I can hit escape to cancel that, or R for rotate, or S for scale. Okay, so if I hit N on the keyboard, I can bring up my properties panel over here because we may use this tonight. I'm going to scroll down on the bottom and I'm going to check off the screencast keys plugin that I have installed, and that's just going to put the little screencast keys up here on the bottom left. So if I hit a keyboard shortcut and I don't mention it, look down here and that'll tell you kind of what's up. Okay, so let's kind of get into this. I'm going to turn off the manipulation widget right now because I want to kind of get it out of my way. So I'm just going to check that box off down there to hide that. If I hit S, I'm going to scale this up till it's pretty big. Left click to accept that. And let's go into edit mode here. Okay, so I want to add some more subdivisions into this right here. So let's jump over to the tools section, look for the subdivide command. I'm going to left click this one time, and then I'm going to turn my cuts up quite a bit. They're going to be maxed out at 10 cuts right here. And so if you want to keep subdividing, all you have to do is hit subdivide again to start a new subdivide command. And then you can keep turning that up if you want. I'm going to leave it right about here for now, maybe there. And now we can start playing with getting this plane edited and in place. We're going to create some hills here. So let's turn on our proportional editing, which is down here in this little box. Click enable. And if you want to toggle this on and off, the keyboard shortcut is O on the keyboard. So that is right there. The X and then 3 tells you how many times I'm hitting a keyboard shortcut in a row, just so you guys aren't confused. So let's turn that on. And then once again, I'll hit G to start moving something around. And then I can use my middle mouse button to kind of get this circle of influence dialed in, okay? Now, one of the other cool things about using the keyboard shortcuts is that you're able to really quickly start constraining the operations and really dialing in specifics, okay? So let me give you an example. If we start moving this vertice and we just hit G, it doesn't know which direction we're gonna want to move this. Up and down the Z-axis, left and right on the X-axis, backwards and forwards on the Y-axis. Blender doesn't know. So all we have to do to tell it is hit X, Y, or Z on the keyboard while we're moving something. And if I hit Z, it's going to constrain that movement to up and down, okay? So it looks like we got a question over here in the chat. Lorian says, can you show us how to reselect a loop cut to readjust it? So yeah, this is a good question. Let's jump into edge mode to select an edge loop here. And a loop is basically just a bunch of edges that are lined up in a row, connected all the way down on or around an object, okay? That's why they're called a loop. And so any of these vertical rows running down this plane would be a loop. And if we hold Alt and right click, we can select the entire loop right here. Just like Shift with all the other options in Blender, if you hold Shift and Alt, you can continuously select multiple loops, okay? Once again, to clear this, we just need to hit A. That will allow you to select or deselect everything in the scene. And let's get in here and start playing with our hills. All right, so I'm gonna move this up in the Z axis a little bit. And I'm just gonna kind of play a little bit with this right here. Now, if we don't wanna keep doing this manually, remember we can always deselect everything, go to select and select random here. And then we can dial in how much of the percentage of the mesh we want to be randomly selected. So if we dial this down to something pretty low, then we can randomly affect the mesh pretty quickly like this to get our hills in place. Another option is to change the fall off of the proportional edit. So we didn't talk about this yesterday. It's a little bit more intermediate, but this little curve over here relates directly to the proportional editing right here. So the curve right now is set to smooth, which means we're getting this really nice, even fall off, like a smooth, hill running through a countryside. If we want, we can change this to all sorts of other things. And so one of the options you have is to pick random. And what that will let you do, if you just pick any vertice on the mesh, and it doesn't really matter where it is, but I'm going to select one sort of in the middle here. And then I start moving, anything in the circle of influence here is going to be randomly selected and moved with proportional edit. So if I just increase that circle of influence with my middle mouse button wheel right now, then I can really quickly dial that in. Now it's going to give you a little bit, sharper noise in terms of the randomness than randomly selecting points will do it. But it's just up to you to decide how you want to use these tools. So I'm going to turn this back to smooth right now, so we can kind of manually get in here and play with this a little bit more. And you can see with keyboard shortcuts just how quickly you can start playing around with these sorts of tools. So one of the questions that Lorian is asking me in the chat right now is, when we eliminated the widget that shows when we select things, is that what allowed me to use the X, Y, and Z on the keyboard shortcuts? And no. So even with this turned on, I can still use G and then Z to affect the X, Y, and Z, and it will just reappear once I left click to accept. So I can still leave that on and toggle. I just like to get it out of the way because I don't typically use the widget here, because I always use the keyboard shortcuts, and I feel like when I'm trying to select things, sometimes the widget feels like it's in the way. So I like to declutter the workspace and just turn that off. So we're going to really quickly run through here and keep editing this until we feel like we've got a pretty random sort of hill area going on. And of course, we want to have areas of small bumps, and then we want to have bigger areas that are more dialed in terms of the variation here. So make sure you work big to small. So you've got a lot of different scales of bumps as you're editing your plane here. Occasionally we can tab out of edit mode to just kind of see how that looks in object mode. And I'm going to turn off my grid here because I don't really need to see it. So to do that, all you have to do is jump over to your properties panel over here. If you can't remember the keyboard shortcut and it's hidden, just click the little plus sign over here and it will pop that open for you. So we'll go down to the display drop down right here, and I'm going to turn off the grid floor. And I'm also going to turn off the X and Y coordinates here so that those lines are not going to show up. And that's just, again, going to declutter the workspace and help me just see my models by themselves a little bit more clearly. Okay, so the only thing I've turned off is the grid floor, X and Y, and then the little manipulator here. So if you want to leave those on, that's perfectly fine. It's not going to affect anything as we go, but I'm going to turn these off because that's kind of how I like to work. Okay, so let's say we're happy with our ground plane right now, and we want to label this. So we're going to jump into the properties panel under the items section, And we're going to left click here, and we're going to call this ground. And you'll notice in the outliner over here, that's going to label this ground now. And so that's an object that's labeled, which is good for everybody. And now we need to start working on our trees. So one of the things that we can do is kind of use some of these primitives like we did last night to start building this. And I'm going to keep these a little simple. So let's start with a cylinder. And that's going to place that right in the middle where our 3D cursor is. Okay. So we're going to go down to these options down here that pop up when you add an object. And I don't want 32 vertices. That's quite a lot. So we'll just drag this to the left. And we're going to decrease this quite a bit, maybe to about, let's go to 8. I think 8's a good number. And then we want to start playing with some of the geometry here. So I want to raise this up. So I'm going to move it up in the Z axis. And now in edit mode, let's start playing with the shape of our tree trunk. So let's jump into edit mode here. And I'm going to deselect everything with A. And now let's select this top loop of vertices and edges. So hit Alt and then right click in the middle here. And that will select that entire ring right there. And now we can scale this in by hitting S and then just kind of moving our mouse towards the middle here and left clicking to accept that. I'm going to turn off proportional edit because we don't need to use that right now. And then what I want to do is, let's say we deselect everything again, hit A. I want to lower the trunk a little bit. So I'm going to hit Alt right click to grab the lower ring now. And now what I want to do is lower all of these vertices in the Z axis. So I'm gonna hit G for move and then Z to constrain that on the Z axis for up and down. And then I'm gonna lower that till it's under the ground here. So if we rotate down in there, you can see what that is. Okay, so now let's play with adding in some more geometry here. So we learned last night, if we go to the tools palette, that we have a lot of options here for operators that we can use on our geometry. These work in edit mode, and so what we want to use is a tool called loop cut and slide. So remember, if we left click this button and then we hover over the middle part of our tree trunk here, it's going to add in an edge loop, just like we have on the top and the bottom. So that magenta circle, if we left click to accept that, the operation's still happening. So now if I move my mouse around, it's going to ask me where I want to put that edge loop in there. So I can tell it's left click anywhere to accept that, or I can actually right click to cancel that part of the operation and leave the edge loop in the middle. So it will average between this top edge loop and the bottom edge loop. Every time I add an edge loop in here, it just averages between these two edges, okay? So now that we've got a few edge loops in here, we can start manually scaling each one of these rings to create a bit more of an interesting variation for our tree trunk. So I'm gonna scale, hit A to deselect, Alt right click, scale a little bit, A to deselect, Alt right click, scale a little bit, Alt right click, scale a little bit, okay? We can also, once we have these selected with Alt right click, we can move these a little bit, make the shape a little bit more interesting. So it's leaning a little bit to the right now. So Lauren is asking, why did we use Alt click on vertices to select the bottom of the cylinder rather than selecting the face? So let me see if I can understand your question here. So you're saying, why did we do this instead of jumping into face mode and selecting this? And there's no good reason. You can do it either way. So if you're selecting the bottom face and that happens to be faster than doing the loop here, then you can select the face. That will actually select the loop for you. If you were in edge mode and you switch over, you still get the same selection. So now we can scale this and have the same exact effect. So yeah, there's a lot of overlap in terms of how you can choose to work here, and it really is just up to you. I was already in a vertex mode, so here it's a little faster to not have to switch over to face mode here. But there you go. So Lauren, you had some questions earlier today, and I tried to jump in and answer those in the guild, but let me know if I still need to explain something as we go that I forgot about, and I'll try to jump in here and offer some more explanations. Okay, so let's scale this in a little bit more. Maybe move this up. And what I want to do is start adding in some leaves here. Okay, so we're still in edit mode here. I'm going to go to create, and I'm going to grab an icosphere. Left click that, and again, it'll insert it wherever our 3D cursor is. So if we move that around, that's where it's going to appear. And so we talked a little bit about last night how even though Blender considers these one object in object mode, so if we start moving this around, it's going to think that the sphere and the cylinder are the same thing. If we're in edit mode, we can move things based on selection. And again, these aren't connected right now. The faces haven't been joined. So we can actually move the sphere completely off and to where it's floating out in space. And again, in object mode, Blender still sees that as one object, but in edit mode, again, the meshes are separated, okay? So what we're gonna do now is let's place our sphere here and scale this up quite a bit. And because I don't want the sphere or the leaves to be affecting the tree trunk as we edit this, maybe we want to use proportional edit. A simple way to separate these so we're not editing the tree by accident, the trunk, is to hit P to bring up the separate command. And I'm going to separate by selection or loose parts. Either way, in this case, because I have only the leaves selected, I can hit selection here. Now that's going to create two separate objects again, okay? So if you actually create some geometry while you're in edit mode under an object and you want to separate it out, that's all you have to do is hit P on the keyboard, and that's the separate command. Okay, so let's rename the trunk down here. You can either do it down here or just double click in the outliner, and we'll name this trunk. We'll name this leaves. And again, I want to jump into edit mode and let's start playing with this a little bit. So I want to edit the vertices. So let's go to vertex selection mode. I'm going to right click on one of these and let's turn on proportional editing for this. And let's hit G, bring up the influence a little bit. And I'm going to create a bit more of a weird sort of shape for the tree here so it doesn't just look like a sphere. Okay. Now what I might want to do is start with a new icosphere and play with it, or I can actually just duplicate what I have here. And so since the only thing we have in this object in edit mode is the leaves here, if we just hit A, we can select everything. We can jump over to the tools palette and select duplicate. If I hover over this, you'll notice the keyboard shortcut for this is Shift D on the keyboard. So if I hit Shift D, I can start moving this around. And I'll just left click anywhere to accept. It's going to leave that selected for me. And so now I can rotate this and you'll see what happens. It's also influencing the proportional edit that we still have turned on down here is also influencing the original leaves. And so we can either separate this leaf object back out into a separate object and edit them individually, or another trick here is to use this other mode under proportional editing called proportional editing connected. And connected will only edit with the fall off for objects that are actually joined, the meshes that are actually joined, if that makes sense. So let me see if I can explain this a little better. As I rotate now with the connected object option turned on, nothing else in the original leaf section over here is getting edited because, again, they're not connected. Now, if I make a connection, we can do this by selecting two vertices, maybe here. And if I create an edge between these that are connected with F, which will create a face or an edge. Now, if I try to edit all of these parts over here that were selected, it's also going to start affecting the other mesh because there's an edge connected there. And so that's the difference between objects that are really connected in edit mode and objects and meshes that aren't really connected in edit mode. There actually has to be a piece of geometry joining them. So let's grab the edge and delete it here. So we don't need that. And now you'll notice that that influence has gone away again. Okay. So slow me down if you guys need me to explain anything else as we're kind of getting in here. I'm trying to go a little quick and I realize that. So remember, I still have that connected option turned on instead of the regular enabled. And that's letting me keep my leaf objects edited once at a time, so that I'm not manipulating this one over here. Okay. So if I want to select all of these vertices that are part of this mesh, but not select anything over here, all we know right now is the C command for circle select, where I can paint the selection. We learned that last night. We know how to select and deselect everything with A. Here's another command you can use, and that's select linked. So in edit mode, and this also works for object mode, but for edit mode, if you hover over one of these elements, whether it's a vertex, an edge, or a face on a mesh, and you hit L on the keyboard for linked, it's only going to select the pieces that are actually connected. Okay, so if I hit L right now on a vertice, it's only going to select this leaf object. Okay, same for this one. If I hit L over the vertice over here, it's only going to select that object, because again, they're two separate meshes. So if you're looking at the idea of connected here for proportional editing versus just enabled, enabled is going to do everything in edit mode altogether. Connected would imply that you're only editing the pieces of the mesh that are actually connected together. And so anything, again, that is part of just this mesh and is connected, that's what's getting edited. So that's kind of why they're naming it that. Okay. I'm going to move this around, duplicate another one over here, and try to get an interesting shape. Okay, I think that's pretty good. So now that we have this object for our leaves, let's label this leaves. Okay, we already did that. Okay, now I'm not going to do what I did last night and create a controller and make it a tree and all of that. I'm going to show you an easier way to just kind of maintain all of this stuff. So even though we want two separate materials and all that sort of stuff, if we're done editing the tree, we can actually just combine everything into one single object here. Okay, and we'll just call that the tree. And so hit Control J to join those, or we can use the join operator over here when we have both of those selected. Now we've got one single object here. Okay, so I'm going to label this tree. And now I can move this around the scene wherever I want. And there we go. So it's a little big right now. I'm going to scale this down a little bit, but I don't want to scale it right now because you see where the origin is? It's just in the middle of this tree trunk. And that's not really good because that's not really going to help us put these on the ground, right? Because it's going to always scale towards the middle of the tree. So I don't want to do that. I want to put the origin down here towards the bottom of this face. And so there's a lot of ways you can kind of get around doing this, but the easiest way is if you just jump into edit mode and select everything that you see here, the trunk, the leaves, all of it. We're going to just move these up in the Z axis, hit G and then Z. I'm going to turn off this proportional editing down here, disable. If I hit G and then Z, the origin is going to stay where it is because remember, that's an object mode item, okay? So in edit mode, you're not affecting the origin because the origin has nothing to do with the mesh, right? It has everything to do with the object. And so we can actually just move this tree up until the origin's sort of in the bottom of this face down here. And then if we jump back into object mode, now it's going to scale around the origin, which is the very bottom of the tree trunk, okay? So it's pretty cool. So now if we use that bottom face to guide us for where this orange dot needs to drop into the ground for every tree, and we want to scale it, it's going to sort of grow it in and out of the tree or the ground down here. So it'll help us a little bit there. Okay, let's do kind of what we did last night when we duplicated these trees around. I told you there was a difference between duplicate and duplicate linked, and we talked a little bit about that. So if you want a more lengthy explanation, you can go check out last night's stream. But basically, if we just duplicate this, like we've been duplicating other objects so far, I can edit this one and do a lot to change this around, and it's going to have no effect on the original. Okay, so this is a totally separate object, separate mesh data. There's no cylinder O2, cylinder. So those are not sharing any information. So I'm going to delete this, hit X, left click to accept that. But if I use duplicate linked, now when I edit one of these, it's going to jump into edit mode for both of them. And whatever I do to one, it's going to do to the other. Okay. And so that's really important to know the difference because, again, using duplicate linked can get you into trouble when you think you're using duplicate and if you mix those up. So pay attention to which button you're pushing or which keyboard shortcut you're using. The keyboard shortcut for duplicate is Shift D. The keyboard shortcut for duplicate linked is Alt D. Okay. So just pay attention to that. In this case, I want to use duplicate linked because we're going to have one type of tree everywhere. And we're just going to rotate it and scale it and stuff in object mode. It's not going to matter. So I'm going to jump into top view here. Oh, I wanted to mention that. Okay. So an easy way to navigate on the keyboard is using the numpad. And this only happens if you have a full keyboard like you have on a desktop computer. It doesn't really work on a laptop unless you do some special tricks to get around that. But if you have a desktop computer and you have that number pad on the right side of the keyboard, you can use those numbers to help you navigate around Blender. And again, those keyboard shortcuts are found if you go to the view menu down here. You can see under here, you've got left, right, back, front, bottom, top, all of this stuff. You'll see numpad 3, control numpad 1, so those are the keyboard shortcuts. And so really easy, really quickly, if I want to navigate into front view, I can hit 1, okay? If I want to navigate into side view, and in particular the right side, I can hit 3. And if I want to navigate into the top view, I can hit 7. And so as you're starting off, just remember those 3 buttons, 1, 3, and 7, and it kind of draws a little L shape on the numpad, okay? So as you head up towards 7, remember that's top. It's an arrow pointing up, so 7 is top. 1 is right next to where your index finger would be if you're pressing the numpad on the 1. So that's front, kind of front and center, right? And then you can use your ring finger over here for number 3, which is the right side. And so really quickly, you can start navigating around the scene without having to use the mouse all the time. And if you're using keyboard shortcuts a lot, then that's some really handy ones to remember because sometimes you're editing and it's okay to be in a weird view, but a lot of times if you're trying to model something, you want to make sure you're exactly in the front view or exactly in the right view or exactly in the top view, okay? Just to line stuff up properly. Now you'll notice some interesting things happening here, and I don't want to delay too long because we've already spent half an hour working on this, but you'll notice as I rotate around, you can see we've got some perspective going on in the 3D view, kind of like we're looking at it with, sort of our eyes, and it's not flattened. And so there's a difference in how you can preview things in the 3D viewport. So let me talk a little bit about orthographic mode versus regular perspective viewing. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you'll get it after I explain this a little bit. So this option, if you look under view, is under this sort of middle option here called view perspective ortho. And this is a toggle. So the shortcut is the number 5 on your numpad. All right. And this will toggle whether or not you're seeing things with perspective realistically, like you see with your eyes in the real world, or whether or not Blender is flattening those down so you can help you line things up. So right now we're in perspective mode, and you can see the tree as we zoom in. It's really big in the foreground, and over here in the distance, the landscape's getting smaller and smaller and smaller as it gets away from us. But if I hit 5 to toggle orthographic view, now when I rotate around, you can see everything kind of feels like the same scale. And that's because Blender is flattening the image down the same way you would if you were drawing it on paper or something like that, okay? So now if I rotate into front view, you're gonna see a little bit of a different view. You're gonna see a grid pop up, and that tells you always that you're in orthographic mode, which is flattened mode, right? And again, you can see it's much easier to see how things are lined up on the plane versus this, right? Because this has perspective. This doesn't. Everything's flat. By switching to wireframe mode, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. See how perfectly that's lined up on the side versus this. See how it's curving or slanting away from us? So that's how that works. So now if I switch into front, side, or top, we get a perfect grid here from the top down, but we know it's not a perfect grid in perspective. So you see the difference here? And I'm just hitting 5 on my number pad to switch this in and out. So if you ever are in this weird mode, which is just perspective, and you can't seem to get a straight on view to line things up, go down to the view button menu here and switch back to orthographic mode, or just hit 5 on your numpad. And again, it'll say ortho up here to tell you that you're in orthographic mode. So front, top, side. And then when I'm not, it'll say perspective. Okay? So I hope that was easy, a little easy to understand. All right, I'm gonna quickly duplicate these trees around in orthographic mode. And I'm gonna use Alt-D or duplicate linked to do this. And I'm just gonna try to randomly kind of place these around with different rotations from the top view. And all I'm doing is quickly hitting R and then moving my mouse around. And since I'm on the top view, it's just rotating all those trees around the Z axis, okay? Because remember, top view, we're looking straight down, and so the Z axis is straight down. So this is where you get to be a little creative and decide how to bunch your forest up together, what story you want to tell here. And you want to go for, fairly random as far as how this is laid out, but it's kind of up to you as far as how to do this. Okay, now that we've got these placed around, you'll notice some are floating in the air and not in the ground and stuff like that. So I need to kind of go around, and I'm gonna turn all my menus off real quick just so that you guys can see this better as I sort of line all this stuff up. So I'm still using the same keyboard shortcuts we have already talked about. And you'll see these down here, just G and Z to move these down. I'm just kind of putting them into the ground a little bit so they're not floating around. And then the next thing I'm going to do is kind of go through and make sure I scale each one of these slightly differently so they don't all look the same height. Okay, so now we can randomly select a few of these and scale them. Now you'll notice if I pick several of these in object mode, they're gonna scale towards each other. So what we can do to prevent that from happening is if we select this pivot point down here, this has to do with those little orange dots that we manipulated a while ago. Right now they're set to scale around the median point or the average of all of the selected objects. If we select this to individual origins, now when I scale, they're only gonna scale around themselves, okay? So that's one way to kind of quickly manipulate these without having to do this one by one, okay? Now, I want to get them kind of close. I don't want it to be like super comical, but ballpark is fine. And then we need to make sure we're happy with the way this is all laying out. If we're not happy, then we can always make tweaks and move things around. We're not really locked into anything right now. Make sure they're all on the ground. Okay. So we're a little over half an hour in, and we've got our scene fairly close to being done now, as far as the modeling goes. We're still gonna need to have a sun, which I'll show you how to create as we get into lighting. And we're still gonna need to assign materials. We're not gonna texture and paint and all that stuff because that takes a longer time to explain all of that than we have time for in 2 hours, but you'll get in a complete scene tonight at least. Okay, so the next step I wanna walk you guys through is how to assign materials. But before we do that, we have to have a few things in place to help us visualize our scene a little bit. So one of the things that we need to have is we need to have a camera, because without a camera, we can't see what's going on. Now we can, there's ways to do that, but we're gonna have to add a camera anyways so that we can render this out. So let's go to create over here. We can jump down to camera at the very bottom. And again, that's gonna insert that wherever your 3D cursor is, so make sure it's somewhere where you can see it. So we got a question in the chat, which I'll come back to in just a second, but let's add the camera first. So left click and we'll add that in. And it's just gonna come in like a little camera icon. You can see how that looks as we rotate around that. And what we need to do is position this somewhere in our scene, okay? So I'm gonna jump into top view. And the question Lorian has in the chat is, she's mostly following, but she's not understanding why you would want to use orthographic mode. So here's an example. I'm in wireframe mode right now. You see how clean this looks with grid for the ground. Now we know the ground's actually got a lot of bumps and hills and stuff, but from the top view, it looks pretty clean. If I'm in orthographic mode right now. If I'm in perspective mode, hit 5, you can see how distorted this sort of becomes, and it's harder to tell where things are, how they're lining up, and all sorts of stuff like that, because all of these trees towards the outside of my view perspective, they're getting distorted. And the further I move away from those trees, you can see how they're parallaxing a little bit, right? The way it would if you were flying over with a helicopter, something like that. Those trees are in perspective, but I want to be able to easily line things up with easy distances and all that. So let's switch into orthographic mode, and now there's no perspective happening, which means everything is kind of like flat on a two-dimensional map. You know, if you were going to map out roads and things like that, you don't want them in 3 dimensions. You want them easy to see. Okay. So you can think of this sort of just like seeing landmarks without, again, any dimension. It's flattening everything up. So let's move the camera back a little bit here. And we'll just get it kind of in a position that we think is, you know, decent as far as we want this a little low to the ground, right? We want it to be kind of human height down here. Can rotate it. Okay, now to look through the camera, all you have to do is go to the view menu, and instead of using one of these other options, which we've been using up until this point, you just select camera, and that will let you look through the camera. Now there's things that are gonna happen if you have more than one camera in the scene, but for right now, just realize that if you add one camera, it'll help you look through whichever camera you add to the scene, okay? Again, if you get out of, you start rotating around again, and you wanna go back into the camera, select view, go into the camera menu here, or you can hit 0 on your numpad, and that will again pop you back into camera view. You'll see that it darkens everything on the outside, so it kind of gives you a little viewing window of what you're gonna render here. So everything that's brighter inside of this is gonna show you what's being rendered. And now, while you're inside the camera, you'll also notice that we have a bright orange box around the outside of the camera viewport, right? That's telling you the camera is still selected. So anytime I'm in the camera view and I want to just jump back into the 3D viewport and rotate around and look at stuff again, anytime I just want to do that, I just use my middle mouse button like I always do, and I click on that and I start rotating around, and my camera is going to stay where it is, okay? But what you can do while you're in the camera view, so if we go to view camera, I can actually use my move tools to get me around on the keyboard. So if I want to move the camera around and see what I'm doing from the camera's perspective, I can hit G while the camera's selected and move it around the scene, okay? Same thing for rotate. I can rotate it. If I want to make sure I rotate around the Z axis, I hit R and then Z, and that'll let me rotate around the Z axis and kind of pan from left to right. Then I left click to accept that. Okay, until we get a nice little view set up here. So we want to get a pretty nice camera view set up until we're happy with it. And then once we're happy with it, we'll just kind of rotate around and get back to what we're doing. Okay. So I know I went through that fast, but we need to kind of move through some of this more quickly to get all of it done, okay? And again, I'll answer any questions if you guys ask them, but I'm gonna keep going and assume you guys are with me, all right? So right now the problem is if we try to render, we're not gonna see anything. So let's just go to the render panel over here. It's this first button that looks like a little camera icon, okay? And this is all of your render settings. So remember last night we talked about rendering, what that is, and basically this is how you save an image from your camera's perspective. So if we actually wanna make this look like a forest, we have to save a picture of it, okay? So I'm gonna lower this resolution a little bit because this is full screen and it's going to take a little longer to render than it should. I'm going to lower this down to about 20%. So that will scale this down in pixels for me. And now if I hit render, it'll render the scene for me. So a couple of things to note about this. This selection here is because I have a graphics card that I can select under GPU. If you don't have one or you haven't switched this over, it's gonna say CPU, and that's also fine, but it's gonna take you a little bit longer to render something, okay? So you can select GPU here. And again, we don't see anything. So nothing's broken. The problem is that we don't have any light in the scene. So Blender doesn't know how to show any dimension or anything like that because there's nothing defined yet. So I'm going to hit escape to clear out of the render preview here. And that's going to jump back into the camera view, okay? So let's look at the chat real fast. We got another question. Can you pan the camera back away from the scene while still in camera view? So if I hit 0 to go into camera view. So I think what you're trying to say is, can we track or truck away from the scene? So panning is always left to right. Tilting is up and down. And then tracking is moving around like this. And then trucking or zooming would be moving in and out. And so the keyboard shortcut for this is you hit G to start moving, then you hit Z, and then you hit Z again. And that will put you in what's called local, the local Z axis. And it would take too long to kind of explain what all that means. But yeah, so you can do that. And this is called trucking or dollying in and out. So yeah, there is a way to do that. Just remember G and then hit Z twice, okay? Okay, so now that we have our camera view kind of set up, we can't see anything with the render. It's not working, and we need to add some light, okay? So the easiest way to do this is actually not to add lights and lamps and things like that to the scene. The easiest way to do this is if we jump over to the little world icon you see right here, is to play with our background a little bit. Also, if you haven't done this yet, make sure that you're under cycles at the very top here. So I didn't mention that. You should be under this because that's kind of what Blender defaults to now, but make sure you're under the cycles rendering engine. And you should see background, and then you have a color, and it may be white or whatever, and the strength may be a different thing. But what we need to do to make this show up in this case is change this to a white color. And if we render it now, it's still not going to show us anything because the strength is turned all the way down. So if we're in the middle of a render and want to cancel it, we just hit escape. We'll hit escape again to cancel out of that viewport. Now let's turn the strength of our background up to 1. Now the background is talking about the background of our world environment, okay? And so if you imagine the ozone layer, the sky is blue, things like that, the color here is what we're saying is the color of the sky, okay? That's an easy way to think about this. So now if we render this with both the color at not black, anything that's not black, and anything above 0 or 1 here, and then we render it, you're gonna see something show up now. Okay, so it's gonna be boring because we haven't added any materials, we haven't really added any real lighting yet, and all of that. All this is doing is taking some basic lighting that's coming from the background, and it's trying to bounce it around the scene for us, okay? But it's not good yet. So we wanna fix this a little bit. So the way to do that is to start playing with lights themselves. So I'm gonna turn the strength back down to 0. So once again, if we try to render this, we're not gonna see anything. And that's a good place to start when you're playing with lighting at first, because you wanna be able to really tell what the light is doing as you add the lamps to your scene, okay? So let's jump over here and start playing with some lights. So you'll see we have many different lamp types in Blender. You got point lights, sunlights, spotlights, Hemi lights, which are pretty much phased out and we're not really being used anymore right now, at least in cycles. And then you have area lights. And so I'm not gonna go over all of these because, again, I have a whole course on this. If you wanna get into all of the basics for Blender, jump into my Blender Unleashed course on theorangeguild.com. And I have 8 hours that'll walk you through everything in Blender you ever need to know to get started. But the only thing we're gonna worry about today is the sunlight, okay? So let's left click on the sun. That's going to add a sunlight where our 3D cursor is. And something interesting to kind of know about the sun is that nothing matters in terms of where it's located in the scene. The only thing that matters is the rotation of it. And that's because the sun is not a local light. It's not on Earth, right? The idea of the sun is that it's outside, it's in the solar system somewhere. And so it doesn't need to have a location. It just needs to have a rotation. And that tells us where in the horizon of the sky it is in our background, okay? So now with it just added in here, it doesn't matter where we put this. I'll put it over here in the middle or off to the side somewhere. It's pointing straight down right now. You can see that with the line that's just going straight down. Now if we render this, it's going to show us sort of like a noon straight down lit scene with the sun, okay? Okay, so we've got some shadows happening straight under the leaves like you would expect on a noon day, things like that. And let's play a little bit with the camera angle a little bit more so that we're seeing a little bit more of the scene. So I'm gonna grab this and I'm gonna pull this back and up. I'm gonna rotate this down so we can get a bigger, sort of wider shot of what's happening here. And let's take another render. Okay, so you can kind of see this a little better here. And again, that's basic lighting 101. Now, if I keep rendering this over and over again with this button, it's going to get hard to kind of, get through all of this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually keep a render going in one viewport, and I'm going to edit the scene in another viewport. Okay, so let's save our scene real fast. So then what I'll do is I'll create another window. So if we jump up to the upper right-hand corner here, you see 3 little lines, and then a crosshair will appear. And if you left-click and drag, you can split your window top to bottom like this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the top window up here in my camera view. I'll turn my menus off. And with this showing here, what I want to do is start rendering, and then down here I can edit and still edit while this is working. So in this view up top, I jump down to the menu here for display, and this is where we switch between wireframe or solid like we normally do, and we can actually select rendered. So let's select rendered. That's going to start rendering from our camera view here. And since I'm on GPU, it's going to take a little bit longer to get started, but you'll see what's happening here. Now, an interesting thing to note here is that it's rendering all the stuff out here too, even though I'm looking through my camera. So what I want to do to save a little bit of memory, and so the stream hopefully doesn't crash, is I'm going to select border right here under the render options. And that's going to localize the rendering preview to just my camera right there. Okay. Okay. So now we can jump down here and edit, and no matter what I do, it will update here for us. So we can grab the sunlight here, and we can actually just rotate it, and now you'll see it updating live up here with the shadows. So this is more like, I don't know, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 o'clock. But this is telling Blender where the sun is in the sky based on the rotation. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, if we move the sun down to where it's in the camera viewport, the sun's not going to show up. And that's because Blender doesn't see this as an actual disk in the sky. It's not a piece of geometry, right? It's just casting light for the rendering engine to be able to tell what's going on. And so if we want to make a sun actually appear in the sky, we have to create a sun object and then make it look like the sun, okay? So for right now, let's not worry about that, and let's just worry about our lighting, okay? So I'm going to move that there, and you can see a little bit more shadowing and things happening around here now. And so there's another question in the chat. Lauren says, can you save without having rendered? So you can save the scene without having rendered, but you wouldn't be able to save the camera viewport necessarily. There is an option right here for this little camera that'll render out just an OpenGL preview of what you might see as a screenshot in Blender. But no, you would actually have to render out this to see this. Now this is changing a little bit with the new rendering engine coming out in version 2.8 of Blender. Eevee is going to let you render real time, which would mean that you don't have to wait for this to calculate shadows and all that kind of stuff. But right now we're using cycles, so this is the way it is. It has to calculate how the light bounces around the scene. All right, so we're helping cycles determine how to light and shade the scene as we go. So again, as I move this around, you're not going to notice any effect change here. And again, that's because this is an infinitely, far away light source as far as Blender is concerned. It doesn't want to have to calculate that. But if I start rotating it, you're going to see some big differences. Okay. All right, so to make this a little bit more interesting, let's start adding some materials to our objects here. Let me check my time real fast. Okay, so let's start with the grass. So I'm gonna right click the ground down here, jump over to my materials panel, and we're not gonna use the node editor and anything fancy. We're just gonna really basically edit some materials here. So I'm gonna click on a new material to add to this, okay? We're gonna name this grass. And then under the color right here, I'm just gonna change this to sort of a green color, okay? And you can pick any green you want. You might make it a little darker if it's too saturated or bright or whatever, okay? And then once you have that set, you can play with adding some color to the trees. So right now, we have one tree object. So if I jump into edit mode, you can see those are all active because again, we duplicated linked, right? And so what we need to do is pick one of these trees to focus on. And I want to grab all the vertices that are part of the trunk. So remember, the trunk is not connected to the leaves at all. It's just overlapping them, right? And so to remember, select just the trunk by itself. We hit L to select all the linked vertices and edges and faces that are part of the trunk. And I'm going to add a new material. And we're going to name this, let's name this bark, okay? Now, I just want to apply this to the trunk of the tree. I don't want to apply it to the leaves. And so the way that we do that is we pick a color. Let's pick a color for the bark. Start off with something kind of dark, maybe a little less saturated like this. Okay. You'll notice in the viewport, everything's getting that color, right? And that's because Blender doesn't know what the leaves are and what the bark is and how to differentiate. It just sees it as one object. And so it's going to default assign the same material right now to everything in this object, even though we have this selected. So in order to just make this assigned to the bark, we have to hit assign to the bark here. I'm going to deselect. I'm going to create a new material, hit this little plus icon right here to add two materials to the same object. I'm going to add a new material here that's different from the bark material, and we're going to name this leaves. And now I'm going to pick another color, and I'm not going to make it green because it's too similar to the grass, so we're going to make this something interesting like red. Maybe it's fall, okay? So something like that. Now you'll notice again, nothing has updated yet because it doesn't know what part of the model the leaves are. So we have to tell it. So we're going to hit L to select all of the leaves. And if you just continuously hit L on all of these objects until they're all selected, now if we have the leaves highlighted over here in our materials preview and we hit assign, it will now assign that material to every single tree object because they're all selected, because they're linked. Okay, so now if I hit tab, I'll jump out of edit mode, back into object mode, and I can continue to edit these materials even though I'm not in edit mode, so that doesn't matter. And if the trees are a little dark, we can brighten this up, maybe a brighter color here, until it kind of shows up a little better. Okay, now we can also play with the light settings. So if we right click to select the sunlight, you'll notice that we don't have a materials output when we have a lamp selected. That goes away because Blender just intelligently knows that we don't have a material. We have a light selected. So this changes to a lamp menu, okay? So now that we have a sun lamp here, we've got a few options we're going to look at. One is the color, which you know what that does. Right now it's just set at white, so I'm going to leave it there right now. And we have the strength. And so as I drag this up, you can see we're increasing the strength of the sunlight. And it doesn't take much to kind of get this turned up to where you can see a little bit better in the 3D viewport here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tint the sun a little bit towards the yellow side. Okay. So I'm going to click the color here and I'm just going to slightly pull it towards the yellow, not by much, just a tiny bit. And that's all it takes to really start impacting the scene with a sort of yellowish sunlight. All right. I'm also going to bring this down a little bit, somewhere around there. One of the other things you can play with here is whether or not to cast shadows. So you can turn this on and off. You can also change the size of the blurriness on the shadows here. And this actually is changing the size of the light source. So bigger light sources will give you softer shadows. Smaller light sources will give you sharper shadows, okay? So if I change this down to instead of a 0.1, if I change this to a 0.01, the shadows are gonna get really sharp on those edges, okay? But if I wanna make it really soft, like it's an overcast day, I can turn this all the way up to a 1.0. And now the shadows are still there, but they're so soft you can barely see them, okay? So we could split the difference and go down to like a 0.5. We like the shadows a little softer like that. I'm gonna leave mine down at maybe a 0.2, I don't know, 0.1 might be okay. Okay, now one thing to remember right now is we only have one light source, right, in the scene. We have the sun, and that's it. Because we turned our background and the world settings down all the way to 0. And so that's why out here, you see just black. If we start turning the strength back up, you're gonna see that we have 2 light sources now, and the background is going to start being the color that we have here, okay? And it's gonna use both the color and the strength that we set here. So if we go back all the way to 1, it's gonna be a pure white. You'll see with that turned all the way up, we still have our sunlight hitting our scene, but the ambient light, as Lauren has pointed out, is sort of filling in those shadows, so it's a lot brighter in the scene. And so, yeah, it's a good way to think about this too, is this is sort of the ambient light of the scene. And so there's a lot of really cool things you can do with the background. You can load in images and all sorts of things here for different background options. A little too advanced for what we're doing tonight, but that's an option. So one of the things we can do is, again, we'll set this up to something like 1, and then we don't have to go pure white. We can go somewhere else with this. So maybe we pick a sky color that's more like this here. And then we might even lower this down a little bit where it's not so bright. Okay. And now we've got kind of a sky blue back there. All right. So now that we have things kind of in place here, we have to decide how to dial this in a little bit. Whether we're going to have an overcast day, whether we're going to have the sun, what time, and you know, whether it's going to be day or night, things like that. So I'm going to play a little bit with the shadows here until we kind of get a more interesting vibe happening. I'm also going to play a little bit more with the camera. And so if we don't have the camera selected, I can actually just right click on the border here and the render preview to select the camera down here. And now I'm gonna kind of dynamically play while this is rendering with the position of the camera so we can see a little bit better angle of the scene here. And I'm just kind of moving around trying to find an interesting camera point of view. And if you can't find a good one, sometimes you might have to rearrange the trees a little bit to, you know, pick a bit more of an interesting way to lay all this out. Extreme angles are always a good idea in terms of getting some dynamic shots. But there's also things we can play with as far as the camera goes. So if we have the camera selected and we jump over here to this panel, you'll notice the little camera icon. Left click and we can go into this and you'll see all sorts of options for how to play with the camera to mimic a camera in the real world, okay? So here's the orthographic and perspective options again. So again, if I hit orthographic from the camera viewpoint, you can see what this is doing. Now, the orthographic camera is based on scale, not distance as far as zooming in and out. So I have to actually play with this to zoom in and out here with the scene. But you can see how this sort of flattens everything down. Okay, so sometimes with video games, if you've heard of or you've seen like real-time strategy games that are a bit more isometric like this, and they'll kind of be at a 3/4 view of the entire world or the map. This is an orthographic perspective, okay? And so if you've ever seen this in a video game, they're using orthographic view, all right? And then basically, again, it just takes out all the perspective, flattens the image down, and it's unrealistic, but it's, you know, again, it's useful for certain things. Architectural stuff sometimes uses it for showing just the side of a house and all that sort of stuff. So let's switch this back to perspective. And we can play a little bit with some of these other settings. So one of the things you can play with a lot is the focal length. And if you don't know anything about cameras, I recommend you learn a little bit about that, but also just get in here and play with different focal lengths. These are in millimeters, and the lower the number, the wider the lens, and the more you can see in your field of view. The higher the number, the more telephoto the lens is, and so the more you're sort of flattening out the image and zoomed in, okay? So with an 18 millimeter focal length, which is fairly common for you know, landscapes and stuff like that, you get a really wide panoramic shot of the scene here. Okay, and you can see how it's kind of distorting the edges and all of that. But that's what a really wide angle lens does for you. When you're trying to go get nature scenery, sometimes people will use a focal length that's like this. Now at the other end, you've got telephoto. So maybe 100 millimeters is more in the telephoto lens, and you'll see it actually changes and morphs the way the camera looks here. So if I drag this to a wider focal length, you can see what that's doing. The camera's actually getting wider here in the way that it's proportionally created. And the longer the focal length, the more pointy and stretched the camera's getting. And that's visually representing a telephoto focal length. Okay, so now we've got to be further away from the scene to be at sort of the same distance that we were before, because remember, it's zooming in on everything. So I'm going to move this up here a little bit. Okay, so may want to split the difference here. We'll go for something like a 50 millimeter, which is a pretty common focal length, and 50 millimeters is about what your eye sees if you're looking around in the real world. So that's a good one to start with in terms of learning how to frame things up. Okay, we'll start right about here, and let's say we're happy with where that scene is placed with the camera right now. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we can actually put a sun in the scene, because right now, you know, we should be seeing it right about here, but we're not. So the sun, typically, if you're thinking about it, is a sphere, and so that's kind of what we're going to use here. So let's put our 3D cursor somewhere close to the lamp here. So I'll just rotate around and click a few times until it's sort of where that light is. And then I'm going to use a icosphere again for the sun. And we just need to decide what scale we want it to be in our sky. So right now I'm just going to leave it the way it is. Let's name this sun. You'll notice that it's not letting me do that because we already have an object called sun. So I'm going to call this sunlight, and this one's just going to be called sun. Okay. But we need a material for this because if we start rendering it, it's just going to be a gray piece of clay, right? So we actually need a material. So if we add a material, name it sun here. We could try to make this, you know, sort of a yellowish color like we did before, turn the brightness all the way up, but it doesn't look like the sun, right? And the reason for that is because we're using the wrong kind of material, okay? You see under the surface section right here, we have something called a diffuse material. And the diffuse material is pretty much a flat shaded material that is used to create objects that don't have a lot of reflection, okay? And so what we actually want to do is this is a light source in the scene. And so it needs to be shining like a light source. And so there's a specific material you can use for this called emission. And if we left click that, now you'll see that it actually looks kind of like a light source. Now the strength needs to be a lot higher for this to actually, you know, spread light around the scene, but that's also possible. So check this out. I'm going to take the sun here, and I'm going to hide this really quickly on another layer. And to do that, all I did was I grabbed the sun, I hit M for move, and then I picked another layer. And these layers are right here. Okay, and you can switch between these by using the numbers 1 through 9 on your keyboard above your letters, so above the keyboard. So again, that's going to be moved to layer 2, so it's hidden. And I'm also going to turn the world back down all the way to 0. Now, we have no lights in the scene except for the sun object that we just created. And you can see a little bit of light right here. And that's because we're using an emission material. So if we turn this all the way down to 0, you can see we're, again, back to pure black. But if we start turning this up a lot, you can see we can actually use this object for our sunlight. It has to be really bright, but it's possible. So that is an option you have if you want to go that route. And as you move this around the scene, again, you'll see it acting like a light source. Okay. So I'm going to turn this down. You'll notice that we can't really get a sort of yellowish color if we turn the brightness up past 1 or so. And that's because it's so bright that it's just white. Okay. The same like any light source would be that's that hot. So it's going to just be pure white. I'm going to put this back over here. Think of this more like the color that it's bouncing around the scene, not the color that it looks like here. So we want this to be just a slight yellow here. And that brightness is way up. So I'm going to bring this way back down to something manageable. Let's just say right about 100 is good enough for us. And remember that the only thing that we care about as far as the sunlight goes over here is what direction it's pointing, right? And so we can pick for ourselves where we actually want this to be in our viewport. And it's not really going to matter because our sunlight is still pointing in the same direction. So this is kind of good because it gives us a little bit of wiggle room here for how we place this around the scene. And so we have the sun lamp here. And remember, the only thing it's controlling is the direction of the sunlight. We have the sun object, which is actually a big ball of light in the sky. And then we have the background or the world. And this is contributing ambient light into the scene and sort of bouncing light over our entire world here, our environment. So with all 3 of these in the scene, we have pretty much a complete environment to show off. Okay, so now that we have all of these in place, we can start playing with some more advanced customizations. So we've got quite a bit of time left. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that I did to make the scene a little bit more interesting. So tomorrow we're going to jump into animation. We're going to dive into how to try to create the sun sort of moving through the sky, and it's going to rise and set, and then we're going to have the moon come up and sort of rise. And that's going to be how we sort of animate a little animation here. If you want to, you can also animate the camera, I'm not going to do that for this scene, but it's a possibility. So let's talk a little bit about how to make this a little bit more interesting. Right now, we've got a pretty dull sky. There's not a lot going on back here, and I want to change that. So I'm going to show you an add-on that I used that's free, that comes with Blender, that can help you a little bit with your sky back here. So to do this, first I'm going to save my scene, and then I'm going to go to my user preferences under File, and I need to look under the add-ons menu here. I need to type in sky. So this should be bundled with your Blender install if you have 2.79. And so if we look at this sort of setting here, it's currently unchecked. And so all we need to do to install this and turn it on is to check this little box off. And that's going to add some menus to our Blender interface here. So if we jump through some of these menus, and I'm actually going to move this window up a little bit right now to kind of get it out of the way. If we look at some of our tools here, you're going to notice under the tools palette at the very bottom, we have a new menu called Dynamic Sky. Okay. And right now we haven't created or used this yet, but what we're going to do is we're going to create a custom sky background that's going to be a little bit more advanced than the one we have right now. Because if I start rendering the background, again, we're just going to get this blue, and I want clouds and all sorts of other stuff. So I'm going to hit this create button, and it's going to say, please select the world named Dynamic 1 from the properties world palette. Okay. So right here, we're in the world palette, and currently we have just the world selected. This is the default name that Blender gives us for our world that comes with our scene. So if we look at this little drop down on the left here, we actually can select a new world that was just created called Dynamic 1. Okay, that's going to basically swap those out. So instead of using what I was using here for my background, it's now going to use all the settings that are over here under Dynamic Sky. Okay, so to start previewing what this looks like, I'm going to open my window up here a little bit more so we can start rendering again. Lower this menu a little bit so we've got some room here. Okay, so from here all the way down, all of these are part of the Dynamic Sky palette. So let's start rendering up here. Just go to the little menu and select rendered. And you'll notice now we have sort of a gradient happening in the background over here. So there's a lot of options we can kind of look at. We got brightness, which controls the same thing that it did over here in terms of strength. We've got shadow, color, saturation, which we can play with a little bit. Three big ones here are sky color, horizon color, and cloud color. Okay. And then we've got cloud opacity. So these little wispy things you see in here are clouds. And if I turn the opacity down, those are going to go away. It's going to take a second. You'll see it say updating importance map, which is recalculating all the things that are happening in the sky, and then it'll start rendering again. Okay. And so let's turn the cloud opacity all the way back up to 1. There it is again, updating. So we'll just wait till that's finished, and then it'll start rendering again. You'll see cloud density is down at a 0.2 right now. So let's crank that up pretty high, 0.8. It'll update again. And then we'll see the clouds get a little thicker up here. We've got sun value, soft and hard, which again is related to the shadows here. And then we've got some direction here. So I'm going to take the sunlight here that's on layer 2, and we're going to remove that. And then I'm going to take the little emission object that we've created for our sun object in the sky. I'm also going to move that to layer 2. So we should only be seeing the effect of our world here, this Dynamic Sky plugin. And so here, if I turn the sun value down to 0, or as low as I can, which is almost 0, you're going to see the brightness on the treetops pretty much go away. So that's what that's doing there. Turn this back up to 1. Okay. You'll also notice brightness here if we crank that down to 0. Again, that's taking our world back down to where there's no light in the scene. And so this is sort of the global control for this entire plugin. And the sun is related directly to sort of the brightest areas that it's controlling. This little ball down here that you see as the preview If we left click and drag on this, we're going to be able to rotate the sun and the sky. And this is sort of a little 3D preview of what position that's going to be in our background. So once again, when you rotate that, let it update, and then you'll see it start kind of changing the shadows and the position of the highlights on the trees here. So you just need to find a good position for this, where you're happy with the shadows and everything that's going on. So this is sort of coming from the left and hitting the left sides of the trees over here. The more you rotate this into place, sort of facing one direction on the sides, the more it's going to be closer to the horizon. So this is sort of like the sun is setting on the left over here. If we rotate it to where we just see black, the sun would be directly in front of us. So we're going to see sort of a backlit scene over here. I'm going to bring this down a little bit more to where we're seeing sort of the upper side. Just peek over the top here. Then we'll start to pull this back until we start seeing some things hit the upper side of the tree canopy up here. Okay. So again, we just need to pick something that we like in terms of the overall look, and then we can kind of play with some of these other settings. Okay. See what this does. It's a little hard to predict how this is all going to play out, but the more you get in here and kind of mess with this, the easier it will be to see what it's doing to your scene here. Okay, so let's say we're happy with this. Tweak it a little more, maybe. Okay. So we can play with cloud density a little bit more. You're going to see that change a little bit as we mess with that. The easiest way to tell what's going on is to change your cloud color here to something that's obviously going to show up back here and isn't so sort of wispy. So what you might do is pick a really vibrant color that shows up back here. Let's turn the cloud density up pretty high. Okay, not really seeing that do much of an effect here. For horizon color, maybe we change this to a sharper red there. Okay, so it's a little bit more like sunset. Sky color, maybe we'll go a little bit more saturated with the blue, see what that does. You can see the clouds kind of coming in up here at the top, so it all depends on kind of what you're seeing for the horizon color back here. But there's the clouds, you can kind of see them there. So for my scene, I actually did 3 different sort of setups. I did one that was midday, I did one that was kind of a sunset, and then I did one that was moonlit. And for the purpose of our animation tomorrow, we actually need to do a few more things before we end up tonight to get our scene set up for that. So I'm going to play a little bit more with these settings until we're kind of happy with what we're seeing here. And then we're going to kind of jump in here and play with how to create some different backgrounds and effects. So it's kind of interesting. Dim the sky color a little bit. Cloud color, let's leave that at sort of a, I don't know, maybe a greenish blue. Horizon color, we could try to go for a golden. This one tends to need to be a little bit brighter to not feel so murky back here. And if it's still feeling a little, unrealistic, we can kind of pull this back towards the middle so it desaturates that color a little bit more, and then it'll feel a little bit more realistic. Sometimes you can also play around with just switching the colors around. So if I just hit Control C to copy this blue color, I can paste it into the horizon color with Control V. And then I can try to pick a sort of yellowish color here for the sky, and it will swap those, and we'll see how that looks. Okay, so maybe that's a little bit easier to get that blue sky that we're looking for. So we'll go here, a little bit more saturated again for the sky color. Yeah, there we go. We got a little bit of white clouds happening there. Okay, so those are showing up a little better now. Okay, so I'm gonna turn on layer 2. If I hold shift and left click, that will turn these back on for us. I don't really need my sunlight anymore back here because we've already got the sun from the sky back here in the world and the sunlight from our emitter object kind of casting shadows. So rather than having all three of these, I'm just going to move this again to another layer, and that's going to hide that from the scene for us. Now you will have to remember, every time you use this dynamic sky and you make a change anywhere in the scene and it tries to render it, it's going to have to update this little map that it's using. So just remember to look for that. Don't think that Blender's crashing or anything like that. It's fine, but that's something to pay attention to. Okay. So let's talk about how to create some different effects as we're getting into thinking about our animation for tomorrow. To do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this scene, and I'm going to save another version of this. And if you want to incrementally increase the scene by just one number as you're saving versions of your scene, you can just hit this plus and minus icon over here as you save, and it will add a number right here, which is a really handy little feature to help you keep up with versions of your files. So now I want to turn this into sort of a nighttime scene. Okay, so I'll show you how I did that. Pretty simple. We keep everything the same as far as our layout goes, and then we're just going to switch our settings over here. So for the horizon color, we're going to drop this way down to something fairly black. Let that update and see what that looks like. Okay. Clouds are going to be fairly bright towards the white here. Sky color I want to be sort of a deeper blue over here. So we'll pull that down. Okay, now the density for the clouds, I'm going to pull back. So you can see the holes are sort of popping in here. Let's pull that way down. Let's turn that all the way down and see what happens. Okay, not much. So interesting controls here. You can also change the cloud opacity if you want to lower how transparent these are. Okay, so maybe something like this. Bring the horizon back towards this deep blue. There we go. Now we're getting a little bit more of that nighttime sky effect. Okay, so you'll notice it also changes sort of the effect on our shadows. Our shadows are a little bit more blue now because it's reflecting the sky. So what we might also do is kind of pull this around to where it's more of a purplish color to get a little bit more variation here. Let's see what that's kind of doing up here. Go the other direction towards a more aquamarine and see what that does. Okay, it's kind of interesting. Let's go somewhere like that. So if the brightness is not where we want it, again, we can start playing with lots of settings here. So we have our brightness for brightness. We have our brightness for our background here we can play with. The sun needs to kind of be more of a bluish white tint for the moon. And then I'm going to take down the intensity a little bit, maybe down to a 50, and play with that and see what that looks like. Trying to get rid of this massive highlight that we have back here. So we'll pull this back down. Okay. We could also play a little bit with the sun value. Drop that down to 0.6 and see how the highlights up here affect that. Okay, so this is feeling a lot more dusky now. It's a little too much, so let's kind of split the difference. It's a little better. And now let's play with adding a star field. So I might move the moon over a little bit over here. Get it kind of in between these two lines of trees here. Okay, now let's play a little bit with our stars. I'm going to lower the cloud opacity quite a bit lower so we can see these in the background. Okay, so to do the stars, let's talk about how we would model these. Basically, all I did for this was I took a grid and I created tiny little faces for all the little star speckles in the sky. And so to do that, it's pretty simple. We'll jump into sort of a front view here. Let's add a plane. And let's rotate this from the side view this direction by about 90 degrees. So we can type that in over here. And then I want to center this in my camera view here. And then we're going to scale this way up. Okay. Let's scale this a little bit wider here. This needs to be behind the moon. And then after it's back there, what we need to do is kind of line it up with the camera a little bit so that it's sort of parallel with the way the camera is facing. So I'm going to rotate this until we sort of fill in the background over here. Something kind of like that. Now let's play with our plane in edit mode. So jump into edit mode. We need to subdivide this. So we will grab our subdivide tool here and let's make sure we have our options down here showing. Crank that up. Then I'm going to subdivide again. Again, we're going to crank that up. And I want this to be really, really dense. So a lot of points and faces, okay? So just fill it up with tons. Okay, so I'm going to deselect everything. We just have tons of faces back here. Jump into face mode. I'm going to go to select random. And in this case, I want to select most of the points that you're seeing here. So all of the ones in orange, we're going to get rid of and delete. So we're going to select quite a few back here. And once I have all of those selected, all I need to do is hit X and choose faces to delete those. And now what we need to do is play around with the positioning of our stars so that we're not getting any of these sort of connected strands that you see here. So you can go through here if you want and just pick out the ones that are sort of too close to each other if you want to do that, and just start getting rid of a bunch of stars that you feel like are sort of not in the right position. X and delete those faces. You can also just keep selecting the random faces until you feel like you've gotten enough of these deleted, that you've just got sort of a sparse selection of stars in the background here. And that's a pretty quick way to do it. Okay. And so then it really just comes down to picking out the 2 or 3 areas that you see in your camera view that you feel like need to be cleaned up a little bit. And we're just going to delete these individual faces until we don't have any that are touching or connected. They need to be separate faces floating in space. Okay. And once you've got all of that sort of ironed out, or they're all separated like this, all we have to do is select all the faces in edit mode. And then using, again, individual origins, we're just going to scale them down until they're really, really small. Okay. You see how small these are. So now if we jump into object mode, all we have are stars that are really tiny faces floating out in space. Now, again, we can add a material for these. So we'll hit new, we'll call these stars. And once again, we're just going to pick emission. And we'll turn this all the way up to a pure white. And let's take a look at our star field back here. Okay. So we have a couple of options as far as how to brighten these up. We can either scale them up, and the bigger an object, the more the strength here counts because it has more surface area, or we can just crank this strength up a lot higher and it will also just make these brighter as well. So once again, it's importing that up, updating that importance map. So once that's finished, you'll see these get a little brighter. And that's pretty much all you need to do to create the star field. And as long as it's behind the moon back here, you're not going to see any sort of distortion or problems happening. These aren't really going to contribute to shadows that you see around the scene because there's not enough of them and they're not big enough to really cast a bunch of shadows. And they're also fairly far away from all these objects. So don't worry about that. But that's all I did to create the nighttime scene, was kind of play with these colors and mess with that a little bit. So keep tweaking this a little bit until we find something we're happy with. All right, so we got a little less than half an hour left. Does anybody have any questions in the chat they want to talk about right now before we kind of move on and talk a little bit more about what we're doing tomorrow? Because we got just enough time tonight, I might be able to give you a quick primer on animation before tomorrow. Is this helping you guys? You guys getting something out of this? So here's one thing you can do that we haven't done yet. We noticed that when we render, we have colors and everything based on these materials, but none of the objects in our 3D viewport have colors assigned to them. So if you want to do that, all you have to do is grab your object here. In terms of the grass here, we have that selected for the ground. We can hit Control-C on this green color to copy that. And then at the very bottom, if you open the settings here, you can paste this into the viewport color, and that will actually change this to preview that color in the OpenGL viewport for you. And so we can quickly do the same thing for all of our other objects or our materials here. And there we go. A little easier to organize and see things now. Okay, so Lauren's saying she couldn't understand why Blender couldn't tell the difference between the leaves and the trunks. And I think you're talking about when we were assigning the materials. Is that right? Can you confirm that for me? Okay, so let's talk about that. Blender is only going to be able to comprehend kind of what we tell it, right? And so it tries not to make assumptions for us about what we're doing. And so let's talk about why this is the way it is. So I'm going to add a bunch of objects out here to the side. And we're going to sort of overlap these. Okay, so let's join all three of these objects together with Control J. And now those are one object. And in edit mode, we have three separate unconnected meshes, okay? So again, we can still edit these separately. Okay, but in object mode, Blender sees this whole thing as one object. And again, think about it like this. What if each one of these mesh objects was an individual leaf on a tree, right? Well, Blender doesn't know that those are quote unquote leaves, right? It just knows that those are polygons, they're shapes. And so when we assign a material over here, it's gonna just blanket assign one material to the entire object at first, because it doesn't understand specifically what material should be assigned to what part of the mesh, okay? So if we want one of these to, again, I'm just gonna use colors here to help you kind of visualize this. So for the viewport color, if we wanna make one of these green, right now, this one material is applied to all of these meshes. And so if we jump into edit mode, we need to use edit mode to help us tell Blender what sections to assign what material, okay? So let's add in a couple of materials here so that we have some other options. We want one that's gonna be pink. We want one that's gonna be maybe yellow, something like that. And so all three of these, this one's green, this one's pink, this one's yellow, but these could be anything. This could be dirt, grass, oil, it could be anything. Right now, Blender only knows about green because we haven't told it about pink and yellow for these other objects in here. So if we go into edit mode, right now it's got green assigned to all of this. But if we want to assign yellow to just the plane, we have to select the material and we have to tell it what to assign. So if we hit assign, it's going to assign that material to that part of the mesh. And this will happen with whatever selection you have. So we can do this for any kind of piece. So if we just want to do it to these faces that we have selected, it's going to select pink, hit assign, and only those parts are going to get that material, okay? And so we have to intelligently kind of inform Blender what we're trying to accomplish here, because it doesn't know what trees and leaves and cars and people and all that sort of stuff are. And this is just the way that we have to get around that, is creating one object that's a complex object, has multiple materials. So if you take me, for example, I have skin, and that's one material. I have a shirt that's made up of cotton, that's another material. I have fingernails, which are made up of a different material than my regular skin is for my hand. I have a ring on, so that's gonna be metal, that's another material. My hair is a totally different material. All of those things have to be added to the object as separate materials so that we can kind of zero in on all the different looks we're going for on an object, okay? So that's why things operate the way they do. And it's only this way because, again, when we first create these objects, Blender doesn't know what needs to be assigned what. And so it's just gonna pick one and whatever material that we have over here is gonna assign. So a good example of this is, again, we get in here and we don't have anything selected and we wanna select everything that's pink. Well, we can hit select and it's gonna give us all the faces that have pink materials, okay? And just like that's true, if we delete materials, let's say we delete green, this object no longer understands what that material is. So it's going to default to the next one on the list and assign that to the rest of the faces because it has to have a material. If we delete the yellow, all of these objects, all of these meshes, these pieces of these meshes are going to get assigned pink because pink is the only thing left in the list, and so on and so forth. And so that's kind of the way that it defaults to. Hope that made sense. But got about 15 minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about animation. Okay, so I'm gonna get rid of that view up there. We don't need that right now. I'm actually just gonna create a brand new scene. Let's add in a ball here. Okay, so animation. Here's animation 101 for anybody starting off that wants to know kind of how to get into this. We're only going to talk about sort of object level animation. We're not going to do bones, nothing complicated. We're just going to do keyframe animation with entire objects, okay? So think about animating things like an object's position, an object's rotation, and an object's scale. Those things by themselves leave you with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different attributes to keep up with in terms of what's happening on the timeline down here, okay? And if we haven't talked about this before, this little thing that is always in the bottom that looks sort of like, you know, a football field with 10 yards, 20 yards, 30 yards, all this down here is Blender's timeline for animation. So if you left click and drag, you can actually change the number for the frame that you're on in terms of animation. Basic animation principles. Television is played back at 30 frames a second. So if we start playing back our animation, you'll see that right now this is set to film, and film is played back at 24 frames a second. So you'll see this zooming through the timeline down here. When it gets to the end, it's going to repeat back at 0 or 1. And our start and end is right here, which correlates to the same settings that you have in the render settings over here for start frame and end frame, 1 to 250. So you can change the frames per second if you want by selecting them from this drop-down box. And there's all of these settings. I'm not going to go into the difference between all of these, but basically 24 is going to be for film. 30 is if you're in America. 30 is what you're going to use for television output for commercials, things like that. 25 is PAL if you're in Europe or the rest of the world, basically, if that's what you're going to use. So I typically stick with 24 because a lot of what I do is film-based, and so that's what I use to animate with. But anyways, you can left-click and scrub through the timeline down here as you drag. You can also type in a specific frame number right here, and it will jump to that frame for you. And so we need to talk about the idea of animation and moving an object around a scene. The way this works is with something called keyframing. And so if I'm on frame 1 right here, and I want this object to start over here, what I want to do is I want to keyframe the position. So we want this object to go from point A on the left to point B on the right. And let's say we want that to take 1 second. Well, since our frame rate is set to 24 frames per second, that means we have to move 24 frames for it to go from here to here in 1 second of time, okay? So let's just set our end frame to 24. So we're only dealing with this one little short range right here. So we're gonna start by wanting our object to be here. The only thing that we have to really pay attention to right now is the Y position, which is where we've put this on the Y axis. The rest of these are 0. We're not moving those around. We're not changing scale or rotation or anything like that. We just are concerned with this Y coordinate, okay? So the easiest way to tell Blender that this is the starting point is to insert a keyframe. And the way you do that is you can right click and you can just hit insert keyframe. So what it's going to do is it's going to, by default, keyframe the entire position. So the entire position in space is an X, Y, and Z coordinate. It's not just a Y coordinate. So let's undo that with Control Z. Yellow will indicate that there's a keyframe on this frame that we have selected down here. So if we just want to keyframe the Y position, we can right click and we can say, I think it's insert a single keyframe. Yeah. And so that will only key the Y coordinate and not the X and the Z. Okay. So that is our starting point. You'll also notice, other than it being yellow and the transform for the location of the Y coordinate up here, you're going to see where it says the name of the object and the frame that we're on, which is 1. It's going to turn yellow to tell you there's a keyframe here. Down here in the timeline, you're also going to notice a yellow line to indicate a keyframe. So now let's move it all the way to the end of our 1 second timeline, which is frame number 24. And let's drag the ball to the right side of our screen. So now we have to add another keyframe to let this know that this is the in position, okay? So it's not just gonna add one for you automatically. You're gonna have to right click and again, insert a single keyframe. Now, when you drag from one point to the other, it's going to animate that from point A to point B. And that, in a nutshell, is how you get started animating. Tomorrow, I'm going to do a fairly comprehensive overview of keyframes and all the pieces of them and how to start manipulating them in the graph editor. And we'll kind of talk about how to get into animation. Like I mentioned before, if you guys watched the other stream, animation is a very complex topic. And so it would take me lots of streams to just talk about animation to cover everything. So don't expect that we're going to be able to do, game character animations, things like that right away, because it won't happen. There's a lot to learn before we get to there. But just to kind of give you some more examples of things that you can do, I'm not going to talk about how this all works, but I'll show you what you can do. So again, we have a starting point, we have an ending point. If we want to try to make it sort of fly through the air instead of just dragging across the ground, what we can do is in the middle somewhere, let's drag it up a little bit and let's insert a keyframe here. Now, the problem is that we can't insert a keyframe in the Y position because that's just left to right. We have to insert a keyframe on the vertical position. That's the Z axis. So let's right click and insert a single keyframe here. And now it's going to go from left to right. But we didn't give it a starting point for on the ground on frame 1 and on frame 24. We just gave it one keyframe for the Z channel, which is up in the air. So it doesn't know that we want it to arc through the air, okay? So let's go back to frame 1 right here. Let's say, all right, zero this out. I want you to start on the ground. Let's insert another keyframe, right click and insert that. Now these are both yellow to tell us that there's 2 keyframes on this one frame here. And then as I drag over here, it's gonna start arcing up, but now there's only 2 keyframes for the Z axis, the one on the ground and the one up in the air. So it needs another keyframe to let it know, okay, now we have to go back down to the ground. So let's move over to keyframe 20 or to frame 24 here. And then once again, we'll zero this out and then insert another keyframe. And so now we have an arc. Okay. And again, this is very basic animation 101. So now if we want to play this back, we can hit this little play button down here and it will just kind of loop the animation over and over and over again. The shortcut for this, if you want to know, is Alt-A to play back an animation. One thing to be aware of as you're doing this and practicing is that if you don't see this number turn white, then it's not playing back in real time. So typically you'll see this not say 24, it might say 8 or 9 or 4. If it's that number that's lower than your frame rate that you've selected here, it's going to turn red, and that's just going to tell you that it's not playing back at full speed. So you can know that your animation might look a little slow, but when you render it, it's going to be fun. But anyways, so that's basic animation 101, and then we can get into Again, adding multiple keyframes. So if we want to add a little bit of hesitation with the way this is working, we can delay this lifting a little bit. Insert a couple of keyframes here so it delays and then shoots over. So it's sort of pulling back and then getting thrown like a baseball or something like that would be. You can also drop it really quickly right after this keyframe up in the air. We go a couple of keyframes or a couple of frames up, and then we just say, all right, I want you to fall to the ground really quickly. And then we'll key both of these again. And this is how you start adding in some dynamic types of movement to your objects for animation. Okay. Now, this is not typically how I would animate because it's very sloppy and we can't really precisely add keys and control the movement and all of that. So all of that I'll be showing you tomorrow. We're going to do an entire 2 hours just on getting the animation blocked in for the sun and the moon moving through the sky. And I'll talk about also towards the end how to render this out in a little movie file, okay? We'll talk about options for that and some tips I have for you guys on what to do and what not to do. But that's it for tonight. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. I've been working very hard on new content for the Guild, so about to drop an ebook for you guys that's coming out very soon. So I can't share anything about that right now, but it's about 38 pages of ebook content that is going to cover 10 ways to kind of level up your skills in Blender. So that's coming to everybody that's part of the Orange Guild subscribers list. And so it's all going to be free. If you want to get that, just head on over to theorangeguild.com. You can check out the link in the subscription or the description below if you're on YouTube, and head over there and sign up for the Orange Guild. And if you're on the mailing list, you'll get that for free. And it's just my gift to you for being a subscriber and checking out these streams and being awesome. So thank you guys so much for tuning in tonight. I'll be back tomorrow night at the same time, 7 p.m. Central Time. If you are just tuning in and you missed anything, no worries. All of this will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube a couple of hours after this is done streaming. So about 11 p.m. it will be fully recompressed, and Blender or YouTube will have dealt with it so that it is viewable. But every single one of my streams is also up at this point. So if you want to go back and watch me work on more advanced 3D illustration projects, or even me doing concept art in Photoshop, all that stuff is live for you guys to play with. And yeah, I'm here 3 times a week for you guys. Also live in the Guild. Lauren can tell you if you need anyone to explain kind of like what's going on and how that's working out. She's in the Guild, very active, taking courses, asking questions, and it's been awesome getting to know her and talking with her about how to level up her skills in Blender. So I can do the same for you. If you want mentorship or you want the ability to take a few courses and really kind of dive in deep on some subjects, join the Orange Guild. It's $9 a month. It's really cheap, and it's that's how I make my living. So I would appreciate anybody that wants to subscribe. I'd love to see you in there as a student. So thank you guys so much for tuning in tonight, and I will see you again tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Thanks.